Thanks for listening to the Cultural Memory Studies Initiative podcast. This podcast series features recordings of lectures, seminars, and other events hosted by the Cultural Memory Studies Initiative at Ghent University. For more information, visit our website www.cmsi.ughent.be. This episode is a recording of a lecture given by Professor Bryan Cheyette, Chair in Modern Literature at the University of Reading, on the 1st of December 2015. Professor Cheyette's lecture is entitled The Contemporary Novel, Reality Hunger and the Memory Boom. It is preceded by a short introduction by the Director of the Cultural Memory Studies Initiative, Professor Stef Craps.
Okay, good afternoon. Thank you all for coming. It's a really nice turnout for what is the first lecture organised by the Cultural Memory Studies Initiative this academic year. It gives me a tremendous pleasure to introduce to you today's speaker, Professor Bryan Cheyette, who is Chair in Modern Literature at the University of Reading. You've had to wait about a month for him, but I'm really pleased that he is here at last. Professor Cheyette has authored or edited 9 books, most recently Diasporas of the Mind, Jewish and Postcolonial Writing and the Nightmare of History, and a volume of the Oxford History of the Novel in English on the British and Irish novel from 1940 to the present. The former was published by Yale University Press in 2013. The latter will be published by Oxford University Press next year. Professor Cheyette's research interests include racial representations in 19th and 20th century English literature, postcolonial literature and theory, diasporic literature, Holocaust testimony and British Jewish literature. He has also reviewed contemporary fiction for the Times Literary Supplement, The Independent and The Guardian. Professor Cheyette was a keynote speaker at a conference on post-war Jewish literature that was jointly organised by the Universities of Ghent and Antwerp almost 10 years ago, and I'm very pleased that one of the organisers of that conference, Professor Philip Godde, is in the audience today. Unfortunately, I missed Professor Cheyette's talk on that occasion. In fact, we didn't get to meet until quite recently, right, at this symposium in Northampton. And as it happens, an edited transcript of the roundtable discussion in which we both participated at that symposium, titled Decolonizing Trauma Studies, has just been published just yesterday, right? Well, we didn't know each other personally until that event in Northampton. I've long admired Professor Cheyette's work and been inspired by it. I found his various publications on the relations between Jewish and post-colonial diasporas particularly helpful in my own research as well as teaching. And I think it's fair to say that his thought on these matters has culminated in Diasporas of the Mind, his latest monograph, which is a truly magisterial book. It sheds new light on a wide range of modern and contemporary writers to explore the power and limitations of diasporic imagination after the Second World War. And these writers include British and American writers, but also Caribbean, Indian and continental European ones. Salman Rushdie, Philip Roth, Muriel Spark, Zadie Smith, Carol Phillips, Anita Desai, Frantz Fanon, Albert Memmi, Primo Levi and Jean Améry are all in there. In fact, as I was preparing this little introduction earlier today, I was reminded of something I read in The Guardian recently. It was a passage in a joint obituary for the great Renaissance scholar Lisa Jardine and the renowned Holocaust historian David Cesarani, both of whom we lost much too early, just over a month ago. One reason why I had to think of this obituary is that I know Professor Cheyette was or has been deeply affected by their passing. David Cesarani was a personal friend of his, and Lisa Jardine had been a close colleague for many years at Queen Mary, I believe. Another reason why I had to think of this piece, though, is something that was said towards the end of it. The obituary argued that Jardine and Cesarani were, and I quote, just the kind of public intellectuals Britain needs, mainly because they were among the few British scholars who, quote, range with confidence across traditional borders, something which, according to the obituaries, is much more common elsewhere in Europe. And she went on as follows, and I'll quote the final paragraph. And it is perhaps no coincidence that both had continental roots, Central European and Jewish, which allowed them to span that deep attitudinal divide. At a time when European migration, especially Polish and Central European migration, stirs up controversy and draws hostility, at a time when the UK's relationship with continental Europe is again in question, it is worth savouring the legacies that both Jardine and Cesarani leave, a profound cultural enrichment that links both sides of the Channel. And it occurred to me that Professor Cheyette is a scholar who is very much cast in the same mould, the kind of scholar indeed that we need more of. We are lucky to have him with us here on this side of the Channel today, carrying that torch, as it were. His paper is titled The Contemporary Novel, Reality, Hunger and the Memory Boom, and I'm delighted to welcome him back to Ghent, and we'll give him the floor without further ado.
Thank you. Thank you for your most generous and moving introduction, and also for the tour of Ghent. Last time I was here, I didn't really have a chance to see a great deal of Ghent, and I was delighted to see as much as I did with you today. Thank you so much for inviting me to this wonderful lecture series. And I should say from the beginning that what I'm doing in this talk is trying out some new ideas from Diasporas of the Mind, which Stef mentioned, and also from the Oxford History of the Post-War novel, which Stef also mentioned. So I'm trying out some new ideas. I'm throwing them up in the air, and we'll see if we can catch any of them, to use an awful phrase which I've just thought of and I will never use again. So these ideas are not fully formed, so any vaguenesses we can talk about during the question and answer period. So what I want to do this afternoon is to look at what I've begun to consider to be the structural question of supersessionist thinking. Supersessionist thinking, and I'll define that in a moment. I want to do this in three main critical contexts. So firstly, with regard to contemporary literature, from post-war to postmodern, and finally to post-postmodern, so to speak. Secondly, in relation to the formation of memory studies, from historical studies to memory studies, and finally critical memory studies. And last but not least, I want to end by looking at examples of supersessionist thinking in a variety of contemporary fictions, focusing, I think, especially on Salman Rushdie, with particular regard to the Holocaust and decolonization under the sign of the post-1990s memory boom. Now, I should say from the beginning what I mean by supersessionist thinking. Now, such thinking began historically as a theological concept, and I believe goes to the heart of a modernizing, progressivist Western European Christian tradition. It concerns the foundational belief that Christianity is the fulfillment of biblical Judaism and is structured in secular terms around the new transcending the old. Or in theological terms, the old chosen people being fulfilled or replaced by the new Christian church. That's the reason why in English we have something called the New Testament and the Old Testament. But I should add that what interests me here is the secular traces of such supersessionist thinking, rather than its theology. And one only need think of the recent appropriation of a so-called postmodern or theopolitical Pauline theology, most prominently by figures such as Agamben or Badiou or Zizek, in the name of Western universal values. So this is a kind of recuperation of Paul by these thinkers to indicate the extent to which the secular and the theological are once again blurred in the name of Western philosophy. After the exhaustion of postmodernism and postcolonialism as master signifiers of the contemporary, there remains a strange vestigial search for new foundational narratives, a product of what David Shields calls reality hunger, after the so-called historical turn in contemporary fiction in the 1980s. And this reality hunger is the context, I believe, for the turn or return to a foundational Pauline universalism. And I'll come back to Shields later, as there's an odd conversionist dimension to his work. Not exactly on the road to Damascus, but there is a kind of Pauline conversionist dimension to it. Now, the difficulty for all of us, in other words, is to re-engage with the past without merely reverting to the historical models and paradigms which postmodern thinkers rightly reject. And this difficulty in engaging with the past while distancing ourselves from its dominant discourses brings us back, I want to contend, to a secular, modernising version of Western supersessionism. Now, I realise I've been a bit abstract, and so I'll now illustrate what I've just been saying in relation to the way that we think about the post-war novel. And this section comes out of my work on the Oxford history of the novel. Now, the reason I want to do this is because I want to think about how contemporary literature has been constructed in progressivist terms. And one reason for starting with David Shields' reality hunger is that it is the most recent example of the death of the novel discourse, that has been a constituent part of the history of the novel in the 20th century. So the history of the modern novel, in other words, is constructed around a redemptive narrative. So out of the ashes of the death of the novel, there arose a revitalised contemporary novel, which is newer and more novel than ever. So this is the kind of redemptive narrative, that out of the death of the novel you get a revitalised contemporary novel, which is more novel than ever. But it's precisely this kind of linearity which I believe feeds into a supersessionist narrative. In fact, it could be argued that the very conception of the death of the novel in the post-war period has been confused with a lost ideal of linear progress, which, in an English context at least, took a global form in relation to the waning, supposedly civilizing empire. Now, it's widely accepted that the history of the novel after 1940 is divided into three distinct periods. The post-war, the later 20th century, often referred to at the time as contemporary, and the 21st century. So most critics, certainly dealing with British and Irish literature, divide the novel into the post-war, contemporary and 21st century. But there's not a consensus on where the post-war period ends and the contemporary period begins, so that such distinctions are by no means as clear-cut as those deploying them assume. And the problem with constructing the contemporary in chronological terms as post-1990s fiction, for example, it used to be post-1980s, but then post-1970s, is that it's not unlike Zeno's paradox, that it means that the contemporary can never quite be reached, which is why I argue that it's often characterised instead as superseding an earlier period, the new superseding the old. And what I want to counter in particular is the widely received assumptions concerning a new and more expansive contemporary era of the British novel, which in reading a great deal of criticism of the contemporary novel has been invariably overstated. So the received wisdom goes something like this. After the mid-1970s, the contemporary novel is characterised by having more interaction with the international canon, in particular the European continent and the Americas, and with theoretical concerns such as postmodernism or postcolonialism, French theory, and feminism. So this is how the contemporary tends to be characterised. And such orthodoxies are reinforced by the fact that there was a generational shift in the British and Irish novel in the 1970s from, for instance, figures such as Iris Murdoch, Elizabeth Bowen, Graham Greene, George Orwell, to figures such as Martin Amis, Ian McEwan, Salman Rushdie, and Angela Carter. And this generational shift conspired with a socio-economic and cultural break, which was triggered by the oil crisis, to suggest the emergence of a new fictional landscape or structure of feeling after the 1970s. So there was a kind of material break with the depression of the 1970s, which, as I say, conspired with this generational change. But my key point is that the main problem in constructing a new era, a new contemporary era, is that the old era of post-war writing, with regard to empire, class, feminism, sexuality, multiculturalism, the growth of international and modernist literature, the environment, formal experimentation, all of these issues which were very much part of the post-war novel tend to be marginalised as mere precursors or prehistories which implicitly needed to be transcended or superseded to become really new. And this is what I mean by supersessionist thinking, characterising one kind of novel as old that needed to be superseded by the new. The caricaturing of the novel from the post-war to the 1970s, and especially the assumption that the past can be surpassed facilely under the sign of postmodernism, wrongly pervades, I believe, much of the received understanding of contemporary fiction. So the supposed postal politics of French post-structuralist theory, which was innately suspicious of ultimate origins, fed into the conception of the contemporary novel as offering so new a perspective that it lacked any antecedents. Stephen Connor, for instance, has argued that the plethora of parody, of pastiche, appropriation in the postmodern and postcolonial novel, what he calls the process of rewriting the past, involved intensifying or restoring the awareness of everything, that the idea of an origin must put aside or suppress in social or historical life. So this idea of origins means that everything must be put aside or suppressed. And this refusal of thinking of historical origins means that the problem with this means that in constructing the postmodern or contemporary period as one without antecedents, one without origins, is that it replaces the myth of neurotic smallness in the post-war period, when it comes to the English novel in particular, with the myth of global enlargement in the later 20th century. Giorgio Agamben's definition of the contemporary, after Nietzsche, as a time characterised by those who neither fully coincide with it nor adjust themselves to its demands, is here taken as a licence to evacuate history. Historical understanding in this argument is said to reduce the illusory idea of the contemporary to a mere frame. Am I speaking slow enough for you? You can hear at the back, yeah? I can barely see you, but yeah? Okay. A key cultural factor in generating a supersessionist sense of one era being transcended by another, rather than a sense of historical continuity between periods, was the extraordinary dominance through the last decades of the 20th century of a postmodern structure of feeling, one which produced a certain kind of ahistoricity, even in the most historical imagination. The sense that the postmodern novel has no antecedent is produced in part by what Frederick Jameson famously called a postmodern weakening of historicity, in which textual effects are liberated from their material contexts. The weakening historical effects of the postmodern novel itself was amplified by the emergence of a critical orthodoxy which encouraged a certain blindness to historical etiology, or an abiding presentism which when considering contemporary culture. My concern in seeking to pass beyond postmodernism is to restore a historical sensibility which will allow us to reconceive the role of fiction in bearing witness to the finer texture of historical reality after the waning of postmodern scepticism about the possibility of such testimony. In short, the question I want to ask is, where does the contemporary come from? Okay, so that's the first part of the talk. Now you'll see that this talk has three parts, and I think one of the issues is trying to see if the three parts speak to each other. So we'll work that out at the end, I suppose. Second part of the talk, I want to say something about supersessionist thinking, the transcendence of history in relation to memory studies and postcolonial studies. And my argument here follows what I say in Diasporas of the Mind about disciplinary thinking. If all new academic disciplines are defined by what they leave out, what Jonathan Boyarin calls discipline and exclude, or Gayatri Spivak calls disciplinary fear, then such exclusions, I want to argue, is precisely what makes them new. In the case of memory studies as an academic discipline, what has caused the most anxiety, I believe, is the relationship of memory studies to historical studies. Part of the difficulties here are in the acknowledged centrality of the Holocaust to memory studies, or to be more precise, the centrality of individual Holocaust testimonies. where the question of trauma and memory is to the fore. Now, I'll come back to some key testimonies by Charlotte Delbo, Primo Levi, and Jorge Sempron in a moment. But this focus on memory as trauma can lead, as Anne Whitehead has noted, to the pathologizing of memory, so that it seems, in her words, that there's too much memory and that it threatens to overwhelm the present, And we'll see there's also a danger that the second part of the talk overwhelms the rest of the talk. But anyway, we'll see if that happens. So it's no coincidence in this regard that both the memory boom and the so-called Holocaust boom were both phenomena of the 1990s and originated predominantly in the United States. This initial focus on the individual, the internal, and the traumatic decoupled memory studies from historical studies and resulted in a series of binaries between emotion and detachment, or fluidity and rigidity, or subjectivity and objectivity, which pitted memory against history, where history, in Raphael Samuel's phrase, became memory's negative other. Its negative other. But it should be remembered, and Anne Whitehead also notes, that memory studies is, in her words, remarkably forgetful of its own prehistory. That shortly before the memory boom, the idea of memory and history being dialectically related, in Samuel's phrase, was largely unquestioned. As Paul Auster argued in the late 1980s, memory is, quote, not simply the resurrection of one's private past, but an immersion in the past of others, which is to say history, which one both participates in and is a witness to, is both part of and a part from. So, according to Paul Auster, there's no difference here, as he sees it, between memory and history. One both participates in and is a witness to, is both part of and part from. Now, building on Auster's perspective, which rightly brings together individual and collective memory, Tim Woods and Peter Middleton have argued that the new historical literature of the 1980s and 90s was part of a historical turn in literary studies and part of the turn to memory in historical studies. Rather than thinking in binaries, Woods and Middleton note that memory is plural and is always contextualized, and that there is an interconnection between memory and history, which has its counterpart in the interest of literary and cultural theorists in utilising memory studies as an important bridge between theory and a hitherto under-theorised historical studies. Now, what I think this reading of the formation of memory studies highlights is that our current memory crisis, so-called, is precisely to do with the relationship between memory and history. Or, in David Shield's terms, the relationship between the imagination in the form of novel writing to reality. And for Shields, it's reality that counts. It's reality that has replaced or threatens the imagination, threatens the novel. Hence, Shields being part of the death of the novel tradition. If at the beginning of the formation of memory studies, history and memory were connected dialectically, it was only after the memory boom, which resulted in the disciplinary formation and institutionalization of memory studies, that I want to argue our present-day crisis arose concerning the question of how much history, too much or too little, should be included in the new discipline. This uncertainty can be seen in particular in Michael Rothberg's rightly influential and foundational account of multi-directional memory. Multi-directional memory, as defined by Rothberg, is a counter-tradition in which remembrance of the Holocaust intersects with the legacies of colonialism and slavery and ongoing processes of decolonisation. It is opposed in particular to zero-sum competitive memory, or the memory wars which characterise in particular much of the identity politics in the United States and the responses to the present-day history of racial segregation. Along with Max Silverman's recent important account of palimpsestic memory, Rothberg focuses mainly on post-war France, which is rightly described as a laboratory where the differing histories of colonialism and Nazism overlap. Rothberg begins with a fascinating comparison of Hannah Arendt and Aimé Césaire, who both regarded Nazism as a form of colonialism brought home to Europe. Both figures, writing in the early 1950s, exemplify a time when different forms of racism were not confined to separate spheres, as they are today. He also goes back to the figure of W.E.B. Du Bois, whose 1949 visit to Warsaw resulted in Du Bois qualifying and extending his abiding belief that the colour line is the main problem of the 20th century. All of this historical reconstruction is exemplary and builds on Amir Mufti's 2007 Enlightenment in the Colony, in which Mufti brought together European colonial history and the so-called Jewish question by articulating what he called the paradigmatic narratives of minority existence within Western culture. And these paradigms, in Mufti's words, were assimilation, emancipation, separatism, conversion, the language of state protection and minority rights, exile and homelessness, which Mufti argues were disseminated globally under colonial and semi-colonial conditions and were applied to the partitionary formation of nation-states, such as India and Pakistan, after decolonisation. Now, where Rothberg differs markedly, I think, from Mufti is in privileging memory over history because of its greater fluidity. Memory, in his formulation, is the past made present. And it is, quote, the power of anachronism in the fiction of André Schwartz-Bart and Carol Phillips, for example, that is seen by Rothberg to challenge the rigidity of a totalizing history, which results in an account of what he calls the oscillation between and de-historicization in their work. The oscillation between and de-historicization in their work. So it's the power of anachronism. And I'll come back to this point, but both Schwartz-Bart and Phillips, they both construct racism as something that's timeless, that is basically the same across centuries. And this is what Hannah Arendt called, in talking about anti-Semitism, but it could easily be applied to racism, an eternal view of anti-Semitism, or an eternal view of racism. So it's this timelessness across time that leads to what Rothberg calls the power of anachronism. And it's the power of anachronism which brings together these separate spheres of different histories across centuries and the aftermaths of the Holocaust and European colonialism. And the assumption here, and this I have the most problem with, is that such intertwined histories are lost or repressed or marginal, which is why we need a multi-directional form of memory as a means of accessing them. This is why Rothberg's subtle and compelling rethinking of Freud's screen memory is at the heart of his conception of multi-directionality. Rather than hiding a more disturbing truth, which usually and conventionally characterises the substitutions and displacements which constitute a screen memory, Rothberg rightly emphasises that screen memory more closely resembles a remapping of memory, in which links between memories are formed and then redistributed between the conscious and unconscious, in his words. Now, the problem that I have with this approach is that in locating the intertwined histories of fascism and colonialism on the level of screen memory, however formulated, it marginalises the historical record, which, as Mark Mazower has shown, for instance, in his monumental Hitler's Empire, which follows Paul Gilroy's equally monumental book Between Camps. These histories are not in the least marginal or repressed or even forgotten. It's now increasingly recognised that in the years immediately after the Second World War, anti-colonial thinkers such as Frantz Fanon, Albert Memmi and Aimé Césaire, in dialogue, it has to be said, with Sartre, naturally included the aftermath of Nazism in their analysis of colonialism. And those who were imprisoned in the Nazi concentration camps, such as Primo Levi and Jean Améry, looked in part to the victims of colonialism to understand their experiences. And Améry, for instance, wrote an important essay on Fanon, who was an influential touchstone for him. My argument made in Diasporas of the Mind is that disciplinary thinking of all kinds, from nationalism to identity politics to academic specialisation, has increasingly separated out these analogous histories. But that is not the same as saying that these are marginal histories. What is more, in privileging the fluidity and remappings of screen memory, history is once again in danger of becoming its negative other, leading to a rejection of what Rothberg calls a historicist perspective. A historicist perspective. The postmodern traversing of, in his words, ethnicity and era, in the name of the power of teleology or anachronism, a power which I have to admit I've always been suspicious of, even in the fiction of Carol Phillips and André Schwartz-Bart, precisely because I think both novels have an eternal or timeless view of racism or anti-Semitism. And the problem that Arendt drew attention to from the beginning with this timeless view of racism or anti-Semitism is that one can only have a kind of passive relationship to it. It's very difficult to change or alter this history if it's always the same across centuries. So the problem here is in traversing ethnicity and era. So obviously I have absolutely no problems with traversing ethnicity, with interconnected ethnic and racial histories, but the power of anachronism, which means we're also traversing era, traversing time, I have more problems with. And the power of anachronism also leads to the characterization of historicism as majoritarian, inflexible and falsely authoritative compared to the fluidity, the plurality, and the minoritarian perspective of multidirectional memory. So an old and rigid historicism compared with a new and fluid memory is once again, I would argue, a form of supersessionist thinking. But, as the evocative comparative thinking in Rothberg's book demonstrates, historical reconstruction need not be in competition with a newly disciplined memory studies. My own approach to memory studies, which I think of dialectically and messily in relation to historical studies, stems from nearly 3 decades of teaching Holocaust testimonies. And my critical yardstick in this regard, and I fully admit that it's rather too extreme, is survivor testimonies by figures such as Levy, Delbo and Semprun, all of whom foreground what I call their ethical uncertainty, both the necessity of their memory work and their all too apparent recognition that it may well be a betrayal of their experiences and those of the victims. Levy, for instance, foregrounds his ambiguity and doubt as a witness in relation to his sense of self and Italian Jewish background, which is articulated most explicitly in the periodic table. From the very beginning of this deliberately indefinable chemical treatise, autobiography, microhistory as he calls it, he was at pains to remain uncategorizable, whether it be in relation to his Jewishness, his training as a chemist, or his humanity. According to Levy, and this is a quote from the beginning of the book, human beings are a centaur, a tangle of flesh and mind, divine inspiration and dust. And it's in this impure spirit, this idea of the centaur, that Levy's chemistry is defined throughout as an uneasy mixture of the magic of alchemy and the exactness of physics. And certainly this impurity applies also to his memories, which are full of self-conscious examples of the limits of memory, which he describes as an erratic instrument in moments of reprieve. Anne Whitehead's call for a new history of forgetting could do worse than start with camp testimonies, which in the case of Semprun and Delbo are as much about forgetting as they are about memorialization. Delbo's distinction between deep and superficial memory is predicated on the latter kind of memory being a form of forgetting, which she self-consciously makes part of her Auschwitz trilogy. Turning memory into narrative for Delbo is precisely a form of forgetting. Semprun's The Long Voyage is similarly predicated on 16 years of forgetting before he self-consciously writes a historical metafiction where the mimetics of the processes of remembering, to adopt Linda Hutchion's formulation, becomes his fictionalized memoir. By the time of his posthumous The Drowned and the Saved, Levy was also deeply suspicious of the act of turning memory into narrative, even though he once believed that he had not forgotten a single thing, in his words, of his time in the camps. Looking back at his time in Auschwitz after over 4 decades, so looking back after 4 decades, Levy argues, quote, that I really would have given bread and soup, that is blood, to save from nothingness those memories, which today, with the sure support of printed paper, I can refresh gratis whenever I wish, and which therefore seem of little value. Then and there they had great value. And this is what I mean by the ethics of uncertainty, which incorporates the acts of forgetting into camp testimonies. Acknowledging that memory is a suspect source, as Levy puts it, means that when his memory self-consciously fails him, he's at pains to bear witness to those moments of failure whenever they occur. Speaking of Resnick, a Polish Jew in If This Is a Man, whom Levy once briefly encountered, Levy states that, quote, "He told me his story, and today I've forgotten it, but it was certainly a sorrowful, cruel and moving story. Rather than pristine memory, not forgetting a single thing, Levy is always aware of the limits of his own experience and of what it means to turn experience into knowledge after Auschwitz. Far from imagining the story of Resnick, it's Levy's failure of memory at this point that becomes Resnick's story." And Levy describes this story as a sorrowful, cruel and moving story, all different and all full of, which are all different and all full of tragic, disturbing necessity. We tell them to each other in the evening, and they take place in Norway, Italy, Algeria, the Ukraine, and are simple and incomprehensible, like the stories of a new Bible. And it's this refusal to make easy connections or straightforward narratives out of his experience, taken to its Proustian apotheosis in both Delbo and Sempron, that is always in self-conscious tension with Levy's absolute authority, as Elie Wiesel would have it, as a camp victim. By relating Resnick's unremembered, sorrowful, cruel and moving story to other stories which take place in Norway, Italy, Algeria, the Ukraine, Levy shows from the beginning his instinct to transcend his personal experience as an Italian Jew and make a new and collective Bible of suffering, a humanist Bible of suffering, to once again blur the distinctions between the individual and collective experience. Levy did not regard his suffering as unique and aimed to move from the camps to other places and contexts of oppression and cruelty, such as Algeria, which is an intellectual project that Paul Gilroy has rightly characterised as a form of planetary humanism. Planetary humanism. Levy's references to Algeria in both his first and last works, part of Resnick's untold story, are not as systematic as Jean Amoret's sustained comparisons with the work of Frantz Fanon. But by moving beyond the isolated survivor, they do represent a profound engagement with another kind of Muslim, rather than dying camp inmates, as they were characterised, which, after Agamben, refers back to the millions of emaciated and dying Muslims in Bengal from 1940 to 1943, as well as to the oppressed Muslims of Algeria, whom Fanon later championed. Rothberg's focus on 1961 as a site of memory encompassing the atrocities committed by the French in Algeria and the Eichmann trial illustrates with great subtlety the continued legacy of these intertwined histories. In short, what I take from Levy is his celebration of the messiness of what he calls grey human beings, which contrasts with a monochrome supersessionist thinking, and which Levy also characterises as a form of impurity. As he puts it in the periodic table, in order for the wheel to turn, for life to be lived, impurities are needed. Dissension, diversity, the grain of salt and mustard are needed. Impurities are needed. Levy's distrust of moralising, which he associates with the praise of purity, with thinking of things in black and white terms, was, I believed, signalled from his earliest writings, immediately after the camps. In these terms, Levy's fragile and shifting hybrid nature as a centaur is reflected in the precarious act of bridging the supposed true witnesses of the camps and the world outside in his determinedly impure memoir stories. Okay, third part of the talk. So we're back to contemporary literature. Am I okay for time? Yeah? Okay, so in the third and final part of the talk, I want to look at particular examples of the sites of clash, controversy, contradiction and questioning around the histories of fascism and colonialism. And I want to do this in the contemporary novels of Salman Rushdie, but also referring to Zadie Smith as well. And I'll use David Shields' Reality Hunger to begin this part of my talk for two main reasons. First of all, it's David Shields' Reality Hunger is taken up by my two favourite critics on contemporary fiction, by Bob Eagleston in his short book on contemporary fiction, and by Peter Boxall in his wonderful introduction to 21st century fiction. So both Bob Eagleston and Peter Boxall use Shields to characterise what is contemporary about contemporary fiction. Shields' manifesto is largely, but not exclusively, made up from quotations from other writers and thinkers in a collage argument, what Eagleston calls a collar argument. And it's on the side of these writers and artists who blur the real and unreal. So Shields is on the side of those that blur the real and unreal, and on the side of memoir, rather than, from Shields' viewpoint, an increasingly irrelevant novel form. So the novel is increasingly irrelevant according to Reality Hunger, because we're all interested in reality. Now, by the end of the book, Reality Hunger also becomes an ideal type memoir, cross-genre, hybrid, and impossible to tell what is autobiographical and what is stolen from others. So, as I say, the whole book really is a form of plagiarism, a form of pastiche. Although I should say that it's clear by the end what is part of Shields' conversion narrative. And the book, the underlying point of the book is Shields' conversion from fiction, from becoming a novelist to becoming a memoirist, and what is not. Now, I'll leave the conversion narrative until the end of my talk, and we'll focus on his characterization of memory, which unlike Delbo, Levy and Semprun, is for Shields almost always on the side of narrative. So memory is almost always on the side of narrative. Although for these writers, for the earlier writers, there's a great tension between memory and narrative. But for Shields, he's always on the side of narrative. Memory and narrative are the same, although he's well aware that memories are above all predicated on what is lost or forgotten. Now, I'll start with a few examples of his argument in his chapter. So, quote number 1, anything processed by memory is fiction. Anything processed by memory is fiction. 2, consciously or unconsciously, we manipulate our memories to include or omit certain aspects. Consciously or unconsciously, we manipulate our memories to include or omit certain aspects. Number 3, our past experiences have been dismantled, analysed, recollated, and then made ready for imagistic recall. Imagistic recall. Number 4, the essay consists of a double translation. Memory translates experience, essay translates memory. Memory translates experience, essay translates memory. Now, in many ways, this kind of blurring of memory and the imagination, or memory and narrative, is no different, it seems to me, than Hayden White's earlier foundational insertion of the imagination and narrative form into historiography. As White asks, is it not possible that the question of narrative in any discussion of historical theory is always about the function of the imagination in the production of a specifically human truth? The question of narrative, he says, in discussion of historical theory, is about the function of the imagination in the production of specifically human truth. So Hayden White was one of the first to bring the imagination narrative into historiography. And the historical turn in British fiction certainly stressed both the porous boundaries between memory, history and fiction, and also the necessity of recovering lost or marginalised histories. And it was in this context that the fiction of Salman Rushdie is particularly important for my argument, because of its stark contrast with the disciplinary formation of post-colonial studies. So what I want to do now is just contrast Rushdie's fiction with the discipline of post-colonial studies. Now, an increasing amount of published work to go with Rothberg, Mufti, Gilroy, Silverman, Stef Craps' work addresses the foundational exclusions within the discipline of post-colonial studies, which left out in particular any interconnections with Jewish history, which was expunged under the rubric of a dominant white Judeo-Christian Western culture. And at the beginning of post-colonial study, this term of Judeo-Christian to exclude Jewish history as white, Western, majoritarian was slightly odd, because at the same time as it was being used in a progressive way, to think in a non-Western way about colonial and post-colonial culture, it was also being used by the radical right, by Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, as a way of shoring up Western culture. So this term Judeo-Christian was being used in two completely opposite ways. Also, I think that the use of the term Judeo-Christian brings us back, of course, to the early Christian church, to a foundational Pauline narrative in this context, which again precisely excludes or supersedes Jewish history. But in terms of post-colonial studies, it's done in the name of the new, the young, the redemptive. And so the use of the term Judeo-Christian seems to me particularly problematic, and others have called it the violence of the hyphen in Judeo-Christian. But it seems to me that the return to Pauline philosophy and the recuperation of Judeo-Christian is particularly ironic, to say the least. Now, the reason why Rushdie is so important to this argument is that he began to publish fiction at the same time as post-colonial studies was institutionalized in the Western Academy. And the contrast here between the imaginative and the disciplinary approaches to this intertwined history could not have been starker. As we know, Rushdie, from the very beginning, includes what he calls the Huguenots, the Irish, the Jews in his imaginary homelands as part of an alternative transnational minority tradition. And these imagined moments of identification with diasporic Jews in particular as the most troublesome and troubling of Rushdie's troika is an increasingly acknowledged feature of Rushdie's fiction. And it encompasses a great deal of Rushdie's fiction, from his first published sci-fi novel, the 1975 Grimus, all the way up to 2005 Shalimar the Clown, up to and including his recent memoir, Joseph Anton. And this is in stark contrast to the disciplinary formation of post-colonial studies. So that Rushdie, for example, in The Moor's Last Sigh, evokes the history of Spain, where Jews and Muslims lived together peacefully before they were expelled in 1492. And he also, in this novel, includes the history of Jewish communities in India. By the time of Shalimar the Clown, he's comparing border states in Europe and Southeast Asia, Alsace and Kashmir, where respectively Jewish and Muslim communities of suffering have lived for centuries. But what I want to stress in Rushdie's fiction, even though I want to make the contrast with its disciplinary other, is not a sanguine coming together of different histories, but the friction areas in his novels. Now, the text, the originary text in this regard, is Grimus, which contrasts the overweening imagination of Grimus, who was, by his accents, we're told, evidently Middle European, a refugee no doubt, and whose traumatic wartime experiences in a concentration camp meant that, quote, the imagined world of books and philosophies and mythologies became his reality. In other words, Grimus for Rushdie is not unlike George Steiner, who in his manifesto talked about my homeland the text, my homeland the text. Now, the point is in this novel is that you get this kind of patriarchal figure, this Middle European refugee, whose imagination is writ large in the novel, whose imagination become the reality of the novel. And this figure is contrasted with a younger post-colonial Rushdie figure who is resisting what he calls the Grimus effect in the novel. So the final part of Grimus charts the struggle between the younger post-colonial figure who's trying to gain selfhood and autonomy in the face of Grimus's overweening imagination, the traumatic imagination which has come out of the destruction of Central Europe. So the younger post-colonial figure refuses to succumb to Grimus's strategy and refuses to assimilate into Grimus's particular European history of suffering, which overdetermines the mind and eschews the body. In the words of the novel, the mind of Grimus rushes through this younger figure who has to regain a sense of self so that he's not dominated by the voice and history of what's called in the novel the half-breed, semi-Semitic prisoner of war, Grimus. And by the end of this novel, the younger figure has to destroy the source of Grimus's power, of his imaginative power, so that he can gain some kind of autonomy. Now, what I want to show here is what Rushdie is dealing with imaginatively, the struggle between the younger post-colonial figure and the patriarchal figure as a product of the traumatic history of the Holocaust. What is happening imaginatively in this early novel, 1975, is happening also in disciplinary terms. But whereas Rushdie can make it part of his novel, the struggle between the two histories, one predicated around the Nazi death camps, one predicated around a history of colonialism, what Rushdie makes an imaginative struggle, what happens in disciplinary terms is that is a simple form of exclusion at this point in the 70s, 80s and 90s. Now, this exactly the same struggle that takes place in Grimus is repeated in Shalimar the Clown, published 40 years after Grimus. The fraught opposition between a dominant and elderly camp survivor who, through assimilating to a dominant American ideology, also creates the world imaginatively writ large in terms of his own perspective. And this, of course, is challenged by a younger and marginalised post-colonial figure. They're mirror images of each other in the novel. But this struggle, I think, is writ large, identical struggle to that of Grimus. And whereas the world-making of Grimus exposes rather abstractly the limits and abuses of the imagination, of the post-Holocaust imagination, Max Ophuls' delusions, his complicity in shaping geopolitical reality in the image of the United States, in Shalimar the Clown, takes the form of an unreal power politics. But both Max and Grimus are dangerous world makers, and both are driven by their traumatic imaginations, in contrast to their post-colonial counterparts. And I think what's happening here is that what Rushdie is doing is both incorporating comparable histories in his novel, histories of the Jewish diaspora in his novel, but also struggling to find his own voice, his own perspective at the same time. And I think this is what's interesting about Rushdie. And it's the main contrast between Rushdie and the disciplinary formation of post-colonial studies, at least in the beginning, which could only construct itself as a new discipline, but couldn't at the time take account of other older histories. And the fear always is, of course, that the history of the Holocaust will dominate. And this is a fear equally in Rushdie's fiction and equally in the formation of post-colonial studies. But in short, I think what's being enacted here is a supersessionist narrative. The struggle between old and new, personified by the elderly patriarchal Jewish figures in all of Rushdie's novels, and a younger post-colonial figure, new and old, which shape all of Rushdie's fictions. And this same opposition can be found in a range of other novels, from Naipaul's The Mimic Men, which opens with the figure of Shylock, to Carol Phillips' The Nature of Blood, to Zadie Smith's White Teeth and the patriarchal Chalfants. But the subtle engagement with the traumatic memory of the Holocaust in all of these fictions, both the incorporation and the rejection, the negotiation in all of these fictions with this history, even in the name of distancing their younger protagonists from these memories, I think is very different from the disciplinary fear which, in my final example, constructs the classic Jewish diaspora in the formative work of global diaspora studies as something that's past, that's something that's located only in the history and which has to be superseded again by newer forms of diaspora. And this can be found in Robin Cohen's classic book on the Jewish diaspora, which he thinks of in classic terms. Okay, my last paragraph. The lure of a supersessionist narrative, finally, can even be found in David Shield's search for reality hunger. Towards the end of his manifesto, he has a series of conversion narratives which points him in the direction of the real rather than the imagined, the factual rather than the fictional, the memoir rather than the novel. And a conversion narrative, of course, can be precisely about dividing the self into before and after, old and new, sick and healthy. And it's in these rather orthodox terms that Shields tells us that his first published piece of writing was a desperate attempt to free himself from what he calls the Jewish moralism of his parents. Jewish moralism of his parents, sounding not unlike Judaic law. Nonetheless, he remembers that his Jewish creative writhing teacher, his words, instead of writing teacher, it's a writhing teacher, told him that his work suffered from the malaise of the Jewish race, again his words, which meant that he had a preoccupation with the narrowly moral rather than the universally human concerns. So this is all in terms of his conversion narrative. And so we see at the end of the Shields that in the name of the real, we have the particular versus the universal. In the name of the real, we have Jewish moralism versus the universal human. And it's precisely these distinctions which takes us back to the supersessionist arguments of the early Christian church. Such is the power of these ingrained discourses that our past histories and our memories of these histories return hardly changed at all in the name of the contemporary and the really, really new. Thank you.